Oh yeah! Today we're opening a fresh pack of Excaliburs because some of you guys are weaving 7018s to make it look like a dirt dauber bug nest. We're going to show you the proper way to do it. Now as far as weaving a 7018, especially in the vertical position, whether that be a 3G, 3F, or 5G weld, we're bringing that metal from bottom to top. There's always that topic of discussion as far as weaving an electrode, what you're allowed and what is acceptable. It's been up for debate all over the place, and it really comes down to a lot of things. Welding is really circumstantial, really situational. Things change depending on where you're going. First off, should you be even weaving the bead? Right? It's not up to you. It's not up to the welder to decide whether they want to weave the bead or not. Code requirements for max width. Just in particular, there's a D11 code out there that will say that your bead is not to be 3 times the width of the electrode, the core wire, not the flux, the core wire on the electrode, not allowed to be maxed in 3 times that width. Well, that's a freaking stringer bead. That's just trying to get up a piece of plate. Whereas some other codes may have a tolerance for 4 times, 5 times. It all depends. You should be definitely looking into what codes and what standards you're up to. Some rods are going to be a bigger diameter and they're going to be just weld a lot better if you put some sort of motion into it. Now that's where we get into the debate, what is oscillation and weaving. Some rods require a little bit of motion, whether you do the side to sides, the circles, the triangles, the Christmas trees, whatever they may be, we're doing some form of oscillation to help move that puddle along. If we don't, we tend to have a much higher bead, and that's out of tolerance too. So we want to definitely clarify today the difference between oscillation and weaving a bead. And that really is going to come back to this, right? Because weaving can add a lot of heat input to something. And the other thing we want to talk about are valleys. If we have our bead, we start to stack our fillet welds in here, and we leave a low spot. This is a valley. So we have a low point in that bead. Now that's with stringer beads. But when you start putting a big old weave on there, now you really have to start paying attention to the different spots as you start to come across and pause, because you can leave a valley in between these pause points. You do not want to have a low spot or a missed edge on the edge of your toes of your fillet welds. That's something that the QC is going to be flagging. So those are things as far as the technique goes that you need to work on. So today we're going to go over the proper way to weave and oscillate your 7018 in the 3F, 3G, 5G positions. We might try a little bit of this Christmas tree action, where we come up and come back down. We might try a little bit of the zigzags, the classic zigzags, but there is some crucial steps you got to know about zigzagging. And we might try a little bit of oval action. I like some ovals, maybe even throw in some crescents. All of these things are different ways that you can weave or oscillate to make your weld the size and shape that you want. We're going to keep things nice and simple as far as the machine today. The Thunder 255 NTS is an absolute unit and will not need all the power that it has, but we are going to be using some 7018 rods, so we need to select our rod, turn up our amperage, set our hot start and our arc force on here. We're going to be probably running somewhere around 120, 125 today. We're going to stick weld, 3F, 3G. You can get burnt up pretty easily, so we want to stay absolutely protected. I don't know if I talk about it enough, but we should always be wearing our proper PPE, not only to keep the UV rays off of us, but also to protect anything from head to toe. I've got these new rebars from Ariat. They've got the composite toe. I think they look absolutely dashing, along with the classic Ariat FR. I've been running Ariat since freaking high school, man, and I'm 31 now. Yeah, I'm 31 now. Anyway, let's check out what we're going to be doing as far as technique on this plate. So here we have our 3F and our 3G welds. Now we're going to be doing a 7018 weave up these. You got to understand, we can't just always just start going crazy with the weaves and going wide with it. I'll always be a team stringer kind of guy. When it comes to all the pros and cons versus running a stringer bead versus running weaves, for me, I die on that hill. Stringer beads only. Every process, all the processes. You can fight tooth and nail with me on that one. I like stringer beads. For the first pass in any of these, especially root passes on fillet welds and even hot passes here where we don't have a lot of room to really weave anything, we need to find a different technique to do some oscillation in order to spread the puddle out. Typically, if I do a stringer bead and I just run a straight drag with a 1/8 electrode, I usually pile up in the middle a little bit. I have to get that metal out to these sides in order to lay that bead down the way it needs to be. Same thing with this. I need to have some sort of motion in here so that I can get that bead in there. Now again, this isn't necessarily what I'd call a weave. While we are weaving-ish, it's just adding oscillation. We're going to try to keep to that bead width of no more than 3 times. All right, for the first technique in any fillet weld, especially with an 1/8 inch rod going uphill in this 3F position, I like doing this Christmas tree pattern. We're going to strike up, establish a puddle. We're going to come straight up, back down to the right, and then over to the left. Straight up, to the right, to the left. Straight up, to the right, to the left. This is going to help us get the adequate penetration into the root of this T-joint instead of trying to just weave without the vertical progression at the beginning. We could leave a little bit less penetration than doing the dig as we come up. The big thing is we get to those sides at the bottom fairly quickly, and we pause in those sides and we go across that middle quickly, because we're spending already a lot of time in the middle of that puddle. I apologize for my big head on that. Try and get out of the way next time. You can see here we got some of that step motion to it. I am catching a little bit of undercut, so that tells me that I need to make sure that I'm pausing at a little bit more time in those sides. If I see that I'm building up a really tall crown in the center of my weld, that's how I know I'm going too slow across the middle. And that's going to really play a big part when we start weaving in grooves, especially on pipe. Let's do the rest of this weld, get you a better arc shot. Strike up on the top of it, come back down, hit that high point of that crater, come straight up, to the right, to the left. Straight up, to the right, to the left. I'm coming a little bit further up this time so I can help prevent too much heat and allow me some time to get back down to those sides and pause. I'm even putting a little turn in my wrist as I go from right to left so that I can hit those sides a little bit better. I always find that the root of a fillet weld, especially in the 3G position, is always really diggy, and it's hard to not get undercut. But I think this technique really helps prevent the undercut in the sides as you go about getting the proper penetration you need and the weld size you want with minimal undercut. Now after that root pass, we can go ahead and look. As far as an 1/8 inch diameter electrode, we're pushing it as far as 3 times the size. But I need that little bit of oscillation with the 1/8 inch diameter rod, which is really common for structural welding because the amount of metal that we need to be able to deposit, it's pushing those limits to that code requirement. After I get out of that root, I'm going to avoid this technique. I'm not really going to do a whole lot of Christmas trees anymore because of the fact of how much time I'm going to be spending in the center. Now, what I'm going to do instead, I'm going to make this weld size just a little bit bigger, and I'm going to be doing some crescents, maybe some circles or half moons. You'll notice that these techniques all really kind of do the same thing as we go about putting a pass on here. The biggest thing is we keep that pattern really tight and getting through the centers and getting to the sides. For me as a welder for 15 years and a CWI for 9, it's all about making sure that you tie into the sides. You're not leaving anything that's too humped up in the middle, and we don't have any valleys in between our movements. So right now I'm doing a little bit of crescents, kind of coming up on those corners, but I really just want to make sure I'm pausing over there. You go to this left side, you pause, you go to that right side, you pause, and you cross the middle twice. We need to avoid spending too much time in the middle and coming across and making sure we give enough metal to those sides. A little bit of wrist movement to favor each side. I hope my head wasn't in the way again, but I was definitely in there. My head was totally in the way. Good thing there's enough weld left that y'all can see some of that. But as far as what I would be looking at as a welder to make sure that my weld is proper, see how even still I've got a little bit of a high crown on the center of this weld. I don't see a whole lot of undercut, if any at all, but I can still see that the center is still pretty tall. And that's just going to be leading into getting some underfill or undercut on the sides. So I still have the ability to get across that center even faster. Let's see if I can get you a better arc shot and keep my melon out of the way. You know, I think that's probably the hardest part of this job, especially as I shoot videos alone. I miss stuff. I put my head in the way. I don't hit freaking record. I missed the freaking arc shot again, guys. Don't worry, we still have more weaving to do. We still have this groove weld and this other groove weld on this 5G weld to do. They're very similar, guys. As far as your technique on how you should be working side to side, you just gotta make sure you're spending time on those edges. And you can see that you're doing a good job just from the slag coverage. You should see that slag piling up in the middle. And in most cases, even though it's piled in the middle, it's actually laying pretty flat. What I was going to explain in the arc shot prior was the fact that I like a zigzag motion instead of, say, your crescent motions, just for the fact that I'm able to get across the middle a little bit faster. Again, just not spending time in the center. You got to get to those sides. We're going to do the same thing in this groove, so don't you worry. Now, one thing that I like to do whenever I'm doing some groove weld, especially after just putting in, say, an open root, there's not a lot of meat there. So I'm going to start with a 332 rod. I'm going to drop the amperage down to 90 amps. And I'm going to be doing more or less that little bit of oscillation. I really love a 332 rod because it's a lot more forgiving in a vertical position. You could stay in your puddle a lot easier. Getting over to the sides isn't as difficult, and filling them in. 332 rod, you can stay in your puddle like right now I'm doing just circles. Just moving it around, not really pausing or anything like that, just making sure that little bit of metal that I'm depositing is being moved around. Unlike trying to run that big thick 1/8, I really need to make sure that I stay out of the center. And you'll see me use 332s often just because I don't suck as bad with them. We're just going to keep rocking and rolling with this. Strike up, come down, trace that crater, and then we're just playing circles. We can do circles here. You can do some kind of crescents on the ups on each side. You can do side to side, staying here and just wiggle around. The big thing is we maintain our arc length and we just fill everything in. I don't think I had a single planned oscillation. I was just circles, side to sides, this and that's, whatevers. Now when it comes to the size of a weld on a groove weld compared to a fillet weld, now we remembered that D11 code that said no more than 3 times the width of our electrode, which we're well outside of that, so our bead size would need to come down. We probably would need to put 2 beads instead of that 1, because the code says that the weld face, the cap, the weld face has to be a certain size. So technically you could fill that sucker up with a bad boy and then stringer the cap. However, the big thing that we're going to do if we are allowed to keep a wider bead is making sure it does not go outside of our bevel edges no more than a 1/16 of an inch. That's half that rod size. That's how much puddle I'm allowed outside each of these edges. So I really don't ever want my rod to cross those bevel edges whatsoever. And if an 1/8 inch rod is something that you can't maintain, you can't keep up with, it's too much, it's piling up, you're getting undercut, go down in those 332 sizes because they're a little bit easier to manage. We're going to cap this sucker right off of that. That's the other thing you want to look at is your bevel edges. How much bevel do you have left? That's typically what you'll see a lot of welders make the mistake of, is they'll cap too early. They'll get that undercut on the edges of their bevel. Matter of fact, we're going to need to put another fill in there. We're going to stick with some of these 332 electrodes, and we're going to be getting it just really close to flush here, guys. I don't actually like to see the actual steps I'm making. I want that pattern to be so tight, it just honestly looks like a fat stringer bead. One thing I like about these 332s, I don't have to spend so much time on the sides. Like I mentioned before, I can actually just do this really fast pattern. It's probably my favorite technique. Just really fast side to side, but I'm staying in my puddle a lot more. I'm not actually making those big steps and long pauses. I'm making very, 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 very tiny and tight steps and almost no pause at all. This is the biggest thing that I want to point out over here. When I do these weaves with my 332s, and even what I try to do with my 8s, that weave is so tight you don't even see the motion or the weaving that's in there. There's no valleys in between those. There could not be a valley. Whereas these big wide big daddies, when we take those big steps, we leave those little bit of space and those little inconsistencies. We can go ahead and cap this one now. Again, missed another arc shot. You guys saw this little bit, and none of the rest because I am just not on my game today. Let's cap this one. And I'm going to be doing that same technique that I was just doing, which is a quick side to side, really making sure I get out of the center, keeping that rod inside those edges. I don't care what weave pattern you're doing, what oscillation you're trying to achieve, just keep your weld inside the edges. We want reinforcement, but we don't want a big fat daddy. Big fat welds typically add more stress risers, more heat input, more stress to be found on those big chunky welds. Usually the minimum is nothing under flush. You can be flat and they're fine with that. And there's sometimes maximums. One more rod ought to do it. This is the weld that I would much rather see than this one. We are just about as wide as the groove opening that we had, so we're not much further outside of that. You don't see any of the weave pattern that we're doing. We can see that we've got a single bead on there, but it's not too heavy, it's not too tall, it's tied into the edges. It looks like I do have a good gnarly chunk of undercut right there on that edge. That's unfortunate, but there's no undercut on the rest of it. That looks really nice. We got that one big piece. It's probably still within code tolerance, still maybe code acceptable depending on what we're doing. We're gonna do a little bit of pipe, take what we've learned here and keeping it the same on a piece of pipe. So pipe welding is a little bit different, but not really. It's the same techniques. Now we just got to be worried about moving around things. Got overhead, vertical, and flat. The top here is going to want to sit a lot lower. It's going to want to sit a lot flatter. The side is going to want to pile up in the center, a lot like our 3G welds did. And the bottom is going to want to really pile up in the center because gravity doesn't want you to be doing anything like that. So you just got to keep everything nice, tight, and close, just like we did on the other ones. It's not likely I'm going to be able to get a good arc shot of the bottom here for y'all. This is some 5-inch Schedule 40. There's not a lot of width to the Schedule 40 as far as the bevel goes. So it's one of those things that might be acceptable to put a single bead cap on. The bevel's not wide. The bevel's not even as wide as 3 times the diameter. So it's okay. It's when that pipe starts to get thicker, your bevel widths start to get thicker, and so does your bead start to get thicker or wider. You can see I'm really carrying some metal now. I turned down the amperage to about 85 because there's so much filling that needs to be done with this little rod. I gotta stay in my puddle a lot longer. That way we don't have any underfill. Barely doing any movement up here at the top. Carrying my rod angle now from a push to a drag on the top. Trying again to help keep piling up that metal where it wants to sit flat. Now I am spending a lot of time in the middle just so the middle doesn't sit too flat. Now apologies in advance for not getting all the way on the bottom there. I caught a cramp. Oh, ow, cramp. And I think you guys get the gist of it. Bob never welded a full pipe and y'all loved him. I always love to take a file and dress up my weld. A little bit of filing can help hide any of that little bit of undercut or anything that might look like a shadowy bit of undercut on your pipe welds. And even as a pipe weld, I think that's wide enough to still fit in tolerance of a lot of things. Let's give it a good jimmy. One other variation of weaving or a 3G weld that I always seem to, people come across the internet and argue tooth and nail over it and they see it and they freak out. Shutdowns, turnarounds, and just old equipment that needs to be fixed. It is usually pad welds. They've got just a series of welds. It looks like it could be just as wide as this plate of just a guy welding from side to side to side all the way across. That's a huge freaking weave, man. Not a weave. And I'll show you why. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to run multiple rods. I'm never going to chip the slag. And I'm going to go about, I don't know, 4 inches wide or so with this weave. Get our puddle started. Oh, I think I'm on 90 amps still. Let's turn it up. We're using 1/8 inch diameter rods, 128. That ought to be fine. Alright, now that I got something going here, We're just gonna go all the way across. We're gonna weld like, I don't know, like I said, 4 inches or so. And then we're just gonna go up a little bit and over. Running right over that slag. I'm gonna try to keep a drag angle each direction that I go. I'm gonna come up, switch to a drag, come across the top of that slag. Once I get to where I wanna go, I'm gonna come up, switch back to a drag, go back the other way, right over slag. Freaks people out, man. Do a couple more of these. The trick to this is to aim for the thin part of the slag. You should be running a hot enough amperage that even though we're running across that slag, we should be fine. Top of the bead always tends to have a thinner layer of slag than the bottom in this position. So you can kind of get away with running over it as long as your amperage is set right. You have good electrodes and good technique. You'll usually see something on social media and it always gets, and this is all they ever show, it's just like chipping away that slag right there. Falls off good, there's good overlay. I don't see a lot of valleys. There's a little overlap right there and right there on these corners. And I'm sure that they probably will grind this down, maybe or maybe not. There's no limit on that. Those are a bunch of horizontal welds, not a vertical weave. Sorry again, everyone, in advance for missing some arc shots. It just wasn't on my game today. But I hope at least now you know whether you're doing a fillet weld, groove weld on plate or on pipe, you understand what a weave is, when it should be done, and how to execute it properly. Be sure to check out all the links in the description below, guys. We've got a lot of good stuff from our partners like Everlast, Ariat, with a lot of cool stuff for you all. We'll see you on the next weld. Something that the QC is going to be flagging. So those are things as far as the technique goes that you need to work on. Did it again. That is not an expo marker. Oh, ow, cramp. Yeah, I'm 31 now.